Hola, ¿qué tal? Està molt bé.
Hello, how are you? It's nice to talk about Berta and Ivan because they have established a good frame for me to start directly and going directly to the point. We are very happy today because in the observatory we've been working in the last 3 years about this moment as the final part of one first stage of conducting interviews, research, to report writings and thinking about public cooperative procedures. My name is Mauro. I'm coming from Coopolis Observatory and I'm coming from Hydra. Coopolis is a part of this house, Block 4, Barcelona, DCN. We are in charge of disseminating how social and plural economy work in public partnerships. When we first started thinking about the task ahead, when the observatory was born, we thought we would be doing some research and study of what we're actually doing here in the next 3 years. Can we really talk about the existence of a specific public cooperative collaborative model in Barcelona? Can we really speak about something that is working? Do we have a narrative worth naming, worth mentioning? To start sharing with others. This was the idea for today and tomorrow, on the one hand, to define and to visibilize our model, our way of doing community, public, cooperative cooperation, where we are, where we need to head, and what we were most excited about to share this with other colleagues like you, coming from other countries that we are big fans of, and we really are looking forward to learning from them. And we will try to do this translation exercise in terms of not just copying their experiences and applying them directly with their own metrics into our own reality, but carrying out this exercise, which is quite typical of our personal story, to translate the stories that can be most useful to us. And obviously, after the next 2 days, we can conspire together in order to come up with new collaborations, in order for us to share new milestones, to share new agendas, possibly. We have 2 days ahead. Not only do we have a lot of expertise that we're sharing among all of us here, a lot of other people could have been here. This space should be fruitful in terms of sharing and conversations. This is why we also have the workshops tomorrow afternoon. So this process of sharing is a big part of this conference. I am especially excited about today's panel. Today's panel is made up by two speakers, Sarah and Kay, reflecting the best of the Anglo-Saxon tradition in the last 20 years. Berta introduced them, but Kerry is a researcher, co-director of the think tank Abundance. He's a writer. Abundance, we feel debtors, so we consider them to be our big brothers in the north. And they are leaders and pioneers in the study of two things that are reference points for us. One, on the one, first, a very rigorous theoretical analysis of the political context of the moment and the public or private and the analysis of the public or private collaboration. They actually go case per case in the public-private partnerships, ecology transition, pharmaceutical sector, all the sectors, and go case by case in analyzing this. In 10 days, their new book will be finished, Radical Abundance, How to Win a Green Democratic Future. We're really looking forward to having this book in our hands because it will be for sure a reference book in our police observatory. But not only are they rigorous when it comes to the political backdrop context. But this is also something that we feel very close to. It's not that we are obsessed with it, but we just think it's the best way. It's they carry out an analysis, an alternative to these public partnerships. They call it public common. They have the public common partnerships, starting from an exercise which is strictly based on practice. They don't think there is such a thing as a model, but they come community by community, problem by problem, sector by sector, territory by territory, and by working with the communities themselves, they will work alongside with them, creating this inverse architecture to fight the neoliberal economy. And this is their way of carrying out politics. They are a think tank, but they also are researchers. They translate books. The report on New Labour in England, the public community cooperative plays a big role in their work. So what we ask of Kier today is for him to explain how these new logics of public-private partnerships are working in this new era, in these new times that we're living, a time characterized by a poly-crisis situation, an environmental crisis, productivity crisis, a crisis of capitalism itself. It's dying by killing, and a new epoch marked by a return to, after many stages of neoliberalism, a return to a industrial policy which has meant public expense reinvestment, an industrial reinvestment, one of the most ambitious one, competitive new funds, generation funds, etc. This is a new context where we cannot longer talk about neoliberalism, but a return to the industrial politics by using the old public-private partnership models in this new neoliberal contexts. This is what we ask him to do in the next 30 minutes. We ask him to tell us how this new state logic is working. Some of them have named it political capitalism. Some of them, like Badori and the abundance people, have already the state reducer of risks in order to promote this green capitalism and this digital capitalism, which needs to be translated into public community cooperative action. So this will be clear. First, I will be the host and moderator as well as presenter. At the end, Kier will speak first for 30 minutes. And then after Kier, we will have Sarah McKinley. Sarah McKinley, about whom we're really excited. We've been following her work, their work from their think, do, tank, action-oriented think, do, tank. That's how they call it. You can tell us about that maybe. But basically, what they have been doing is developing a model, a strong model with a strong theory of change, a model that has allowed this model to travel other places. The Cleveland model and the Preston model have come from this community health, community wealth model. We would like Sarah to tell us how this ability to develop the theory of change and to name this public community cooperative model. So this word, nobody really uses it. What can we name it to make it understandable for everyone? What can we call it to make it more sellable, if we can speak about it in marketing terms? This is something we've been thinking about as well. Could we think about some kind of Barcelona model for this? And the other thing we're interested in about this particular model is how public procurement is used. Public procurement. the bidding, the public procurement. The main tool by the administration is their expense, their buying, their purchase. They have a very interesting model, which is using anchor institutions, the big public institutions, so that they will the ones activating a whole cooperative tissue that will end up providing for a series of services. And this is a model where public procurement is activated, and we see that we are not doing this as we want to. So we really want to listen to this, and so without further ado, and after also taking notes on the Catalan case, and which I will take. I will also talk about that later. Yeah, I will tell you if you're running out of time, if you allow me, and then I will give the floor to Care now.
Thanks, Mauro, for the very nice introduction. I feel so good. And thanks for the invitation. It's a really, really great event to be at. Already we've met people from different parts of the world who seem to be engaged in the same sort of thinking and projects that we at Abundance in the UK are undertaking. So Mauro asked me to talk a little bit about a concept called de-risking. In a way, we want to sort of set up perhaps an emerging, what we might call a new emerging regime of perhaps regulation, of state policy, perhaps even a new emerging regime of accumulation, a plan to restart capitalist growth in some sort of way. I'm going to call that the de-risking state, following an economist called Daniela Gabor, who's written a lot of work on this idea of de-risking. And de-risking, it does, as Mauro already said, it sort of takes some things we're very familiar with, such as public-private partnerships have been around for a long time, but it takes that and uses it for a new task, almost like a post-neoliberal task, this idea of industrial policy, etc. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about that, talk about the outlines of that, some of the problems with it, whether I think it's going to work or not on its own terms, of the people who are promoting this, whether it's going to work or not, and then perhaps I'll talk a little bit about some strategic opportunities, some strategic openings that it might present to people such as us, who are more interested in trying to move towards a more democratic economy. Before I get to that, though, in order to understand what's new about this emerging de-risking state, we have to understand why there is a change in policy. What's the situation now, which is provoking perhaps policy elites, political and economic elites to try something new? Basically, we have to understand why. What's the situation now, which is provoking this change in public policy? I'm going to be particularly talking about, in reference to the UK and the US. The US in particular, President Biden, what's called Bidenomics, is like the leading edge of this. The UK's got a new government from the Labour Party, quite right-wing part of the Labour Party, and they use this term de-risking all the time, a lot. They use it a lot, and that's guiding their policy. What I'm really interested in, I think it's also this concept of de-risking is also operating at an EU level, and so I'm sort of interested in what I'm saying, how that translates to, well, a situation in Barcelona and in other parts of the country, other parts of the world where people are coming from. So the situation today, Mauro and Berta talked about this idea of a polycrisis. There are lots and lots of different crises that overlap in each other. Out of those two, though, I'm going to pick two crises which are overlapping, two crises which I think are sort of driving the situation. And those two crises are, the first one we can talk about it as economic stagnation or secular stagnation, a long-term trend towards a drop in economic growth, or the level of economic growth measured in GDP, which is not a great measure of like the social wealth that we want to build, but it's the thing that drives policy. That's the first crisis, and the second crisis is also a series of crises, we could have to say, the ecological crises. But in the discussion around de-risking, that gets reduced down to climate change, global warming, and that gets reduced in turn to a problem of how do we decarbonize the economy? right? So in fact, the problem is much wider. We're living through the 6th great extinction of species, etc., all sorts of ecological crises, but we're going to reduce it down to that for now. Let's go through each of those in turn. So there's this problem of secular stagnation, long-term economic stagnation is visible on the global level. In a country such as the UK, the country I'm coming from, it's incredibly visible. In the UK, we've had 18 years of zero wage growth. So this is like the worst period for wage growth for 220 years. Since Napoleon was waging war around Europe was the last time he'd have to go back to for that level of a lack of growth of incomes. But it's visible much more widely, I think. So there's been a drop-off in the level of economic growth measured in GDP, but that's not how we experience it. We experience it as a crisis of social reproduction, a crisis, a difficulty in maintaining ourselves as 21st century human beings, members of 21st century society, for instance. And so that's a roll-on crisis. That's how we experience it. And then in turn, the inability to produce rising living standards for a wide enough section of the population, that causes political crises. And it's the political crises which have caused policymakers and economic policymakers to suddenly to notice this economic stagnation and say we need to change things. And so we probably point to in the US, it was the election of Donald Trump. We might have to say the first election of Donald Trump. There's a very big chance he could be elected again in a couple of weeks. But that was a real big shock. In the UK, we talk about the Brexit referendum, perhaps. In fact, in the UK, one of the things that's really provoked this change of policy was the election of Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of the Labour Party. And then in the 2017 general election, he did very well. And that's caused a huge shock amongst the political media and economic elite in the UK and have caused a change of policy, I think. This problem of economic stagnation, this has been a longer-term trend. You could trace it back to the 1970s. But since the great financial crisis of 2008, it's really come into focus. It's become apparent, the failure to recover economic growth since then. And in fact, there's various ways you could talk about economic stagnation. And in the UK, I had a very nice slide for this showing different books, but unfortunately we're not showing slides. But there was a whole series of debates that where people were trying to grapple with this economic stagnation. Perhaps it started in perhaps it started in 2013 with Thomas Piketty. He wrote a book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, and when he looked at inequality, and in fact he did this big statistical analysis of capitalism, going back through the records into the 19th century, etc. And he said, look, there's a trend in capitalism, apart from a very small period in the post-war period. There's a trend in which the returns you get from owning assets are much bigger than the amount of growth in incomes and production. He says, I can just see that trend everywhere. And that means something. That means there's an inexorable trend, unless you have counter tendencies, such as strong worker organization, perhaps social democratic parties that we had in the post-war period. Unless you have these counter tendencies, you will see that the section of the economy that is dedicated to owning assets that exist already, and then having what they call rentier business models in which you try to extract rents from owning assets, rather than creating new assets, which perhaps might produce more stuff, right? You can see why that might lead to economic stagnation, etc. And so people have written other books, such about rentier capitalism, the asset economy, etc., etc. One of the other big trends that goes along with that is a real concentration, a centralization of wealth and ownership. And recently there's been another debate that's come along to talk about economic stagnation, where people talk about the role of asset management firms, these very, very, very big firms who own huge amounts. I think the biggest 5 asset management firms own something like 40% of all shares, in the US stock market. Really huge. And there's a book recently by an economist, an economist or economic sociologist called Brett Christophers, where he's looking at these big asset management firms. So BlackRock is one that you might hear of. That's the biggest one. I've been buying up infrastructure, and taking on the role of states in many ways, taking over all sorts of functions that the state might provide. There's a problem, of course, there's no democratic reach to that. I would talk about all of those as like, I don't think that's the original cause of economic stagnation. I think they're like symptoms of economic stagnation, but they compound the problem. They make it worse and make it much harder to get out of that. In the discussion around de-risking, or the discussion that provoked this change in policy known as de-risking, the analysis of why the capitalist economies are not growing at the rate that they were, the analysis is that there's been a lack of growth in productivity. So we can think of productivity as just the output of somebody working for an hour. This is how they measure it, basically. And there's just been this real flatlining, an inability to increase productivity. So if you increase productivity, you can get economic growth. You can see that. And so their argument is there's been a flatline of productivity. Why? Because there's not been enough investment into what they call fixed capital investment. We can think about that perhaps. Let's just gloss the whole discussion. Automation, how to automate work in some sort of way so that you produce more during your working time. So if that's the problem, there's been a lack of investment. How do you address that problem? You address that problem by perhaps the state taking on some of the risks of those investments in order to make private capital invest in those areas, right? That's what the de-risking is. The state takes on the risks of the investment, but the rewards go to the private sector, right? You can see the problem in that, perhaps. That's going to accelerate some of these tendencies towards inequality, etc., which are causing stagnation. But my problem with this, well, there's lots of problems with this, right? The first problem with this is that instead of doing public investment of some sort, you de-risk private investment, but private investment is always more expensive than public investment because states can borrow more cheaply than private actors. That's just a set. The second problem, though, is I think that I just think that they've got the causes of this economic stagnation completely wrong. And that's a real big problem. In fact, when we look at the arguments I find much more convincing about why economic stagnation is happening, link it to the process of deindustrialization. Link it to this process where developed economies, the economies move, the amount of manufacturing as a manufacturing sector in an economy reduces, and the service sector grows. That's what the economy in Spain is. That's what the economy in the UK is. That's to a lesser extent, but still true in the US. And it's something like, the argument goes something like this. It's much easier to make productivity gains through fixed capital investment in manufacturing because you can automate it. In the service sector, much harder to automate. You cannot automate it. Why? Because the service sector usually involves the worker interacting with a human being. The more human beings that worker interacts with, i.e. the more that productivity increases, the worse the service, just because there are human beings and human bodies involved. In neoclassical economics, people talk about this as Baumol's cost disease. It's really well recognized. And of course, if that's the drive, if that's the cause of economic stagnation, then economic stagnation is being caused by the dynamics of capital. Capital flees from workers because we're insubordinate, we can go on strike. It flees from us into automation, but the problem is then it pushes workers out of manufacturing and the service sector grows to accommodate. It's like this is the real big problem which de-risking will not address. Okay, I've talked enough about that. There's another problem. If you thought that was bad, what about crisis number 2, which is the climate crisis, which is the ecological crisis of our time? As I said, in that sort of de-risking discourse, that whole compound ecological crisis gets reduced to this problem. How do we decarbonize the economy? But once again, there must have been something that happened that provoked them to say, well, we need to change our strategy for decarbonizing the economy. And what happened was the idea that markets would decarbonize the economy, would bring down carbon emissions, has failed. It's utterly failed. And there was, if you remember, at the end of the 2010s, there was a whole series of climate justice movements that emerged, Greta Thunberg, etc., school strikes, Extinction Rebellion, which brought that up into brought to the the failure of market mechanisms to deal with climate change made it unavoidable for policymakers. And so this de-risking idea is, well, look, we can both solve the problem of economic stagnation, and we can solve the problem of like moving towards a decarbonized economy at the same time, basically. That's the sort of promise, the promise of de-risking. There's a really, really big problem in that as well, I'm afraid. And so there's been a book recently by this same economist called Brett Christophers called The Price is Wrong. And he says, look, the really big, the big success story of capitalist attempts to decarbonize the economy is that renewable energy has become incredibly cheap. The price of a unit of renewable energy has really declined massively. So it's now competitive with fossil fuels. The problem is this: that will hinder investment, it will not help investment. Why? Because capitalists are not interested in low prices, they're interested in profitability compared to different goods, comparative goods, basically. And so if you have cheap renewable energy, which is what we want, capitalists will not invest in it, because that means they will get less returns in the future. And you can nowhere near get close to the profitability of fossil fuels. So once again, it's this problem of like, it's capitalist dynamics. It's capitalism is the problem here that we need to overcome. And this de-risking is an attempt to try to save capitalism in some sort of way. Okay, let's skip on to de-risking. How long have I been going for? Okay, I've got plenty of time. Let me relax. Okay, so we could define the de-risking state, and I'm just going to quote from Daniela Gabor, who's the leading expert in this. It says, the de-risking state is the practice of enlisting private capital into achieving public policy priorities by altering or tinkering with risk returns on private investments. And so that's across whole series of things: infrastructure, schools, energy infrastructure, all of these sorts of wide range of things. The most famous example of this de-risking idea is in the US around President Biden's policy called the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a really huge policy framework, which is really, it's about trying to get private capital to invest in the priorities that the state has set. So priorities around decarbonization, quite a lot of these are. And in fact, so it's around like trying to get investment into wind, solar, battery technology, etc., electric vehicles, but also nuclear power, also green hydrogen production, also carbon capture and storage. In fact, in the UK government just put £28 billion into carbon capture and storage. The big problem with that, it doesn't work. It's a fantasy. It's not going to work. It's not going to work on anything like the level that we need it to around energy production anyway. So with this, the way the Inflation Reduction Act works, it works on a series of like these subsidies to private investment if you match our priorities. So you can get, they call it tax credits. You get allowances off your tax if you invest in one of these priorities, in solar, in wind, etc., etc. But you can add something to that as well. If you also pay you get 6% of your tax back if you invest in one of these things. But if you also pay the average wage in the industry, you get another 6%. And you can keep stacking that if you meet what the state wants you to meet, if you know what I mean. It's also unlimited. There's no limit to this, so it can be a really huge amount, actually. It's a really huge amount of investment. So one way to think about this is that what we're going to see is a lot of public-private partnerships. We're going to see a huge wave of these. And so what's new about it? We have had public-private partnerships, and it's because they're using these old neoliberal tools to do something new, which is to meet public policy priorities, to do this industrial policy. The state is doing a certain level of economic planning. It's planning what it wants to happen, and then it's trying to enlist private capital to do it for them. And if you think about it this way, there are two contradictory economic logics at work here, right? And one is basically economic planning. The state is meeting, planning, deciding what it wants to happen, but then it has to create all of these tools, instead of just doing it itself, but it creates all of these tools in order to try to get private capital to do it for them. And the way it does that is by making something investable. It alters, oh, well, okay, we'll take on the risks, etc. You get the rewards. And it's trying to protect a different economic logic, which is economic logic coordinated by price signals on a market, right? That's one way, that's one economic logic. And then democratic planning, or no, not necessarily democratic planning, but state planning is or public planning is another logic. And it's almost like they have fetishized the price signal, because that price signal is supposed to discipline what people do, but it doesn't. It can't, because the states take all of the risk away. You know, so basically, it's almost like a gymnastic move to try to pretend that price is the thing that's coordinating when it's not. It's public planning that's coordinating this. So we, in Abundance, have started to call it a halfway house between neoliberalism and democratic planning, basically. And we can take advantage of that halfway house is our idea, perhaps. The other thing to really get in mind, though, why would you want to do this create this incredible institutional architecture to try to protect private investment rather than do public investment? And so Daniela Gabor says, look, they're trying to create a new state logic, basically, but the state is subordinated to the needs of capital. So the needs, what capital wants to do comes first, and the state is, trying to pull that back a little bit towards its own public policy priorities, etc. So the really big problem is this, is that there's no way in this de-risking strategy to discipline capital, to say, no, stop doing that, you must do this. You're trying to induce capital to come and do this thing here, but you're not saying don't do that. That's a very big problem, right? Because the real problem of climate change is that if there are 477 gigatons of CO2, of carbon dioxide, in the fossil fuels that which we can access and burn. If all of that gets burnt, right, if we take all of those fossil fuels and burn them, put that into the atmosphere, well, temperatures will rise to something around about 4.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is basically complete and utter civilizational collapse. Most of the fossil fuel companies are actually valued as though they're going to burn that off. It's a very strange situation. So there's only one thing, we need to keep that in the ground, basically. And you can't sort of entice people to invest in renewables as a way to do that. The other big problem with de-risking is who's going to do it. So Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, this huge asset management firm. He spoke just a couple of months ago at the G8 meeting in Italy somewhere, and he said, there's a real problem here. We need to do, $75 trillion worth of new investment needs to happen in order to decarbonize the economy. 75 trillion. It's so unfair, he says, to ask the taxpayer to pay that 75 trillion. So we, the ones who've got the money, the big asset management firms, we will do that investment for you. And that's very nice. That's so nice of him to do that, of course. Unfortunately, that's not a gift of charity. He's going to get that money back, and he's going to get more, of course. Why else would he do that, right? But he's positioned himself, says, we are the only ones, you states, you can't invest all this because of debt, blah, blah, blah. We're the only ones who can do it, so we'll be the ones who create your new infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and own it, by the way, and extract rents from it, by the way. So all of those symptoms of stagnation we talked about at the beginning, all of those get massively, massively increased if BlackRock own all of the new energy infrastructure in the UK, for instance. The other thing that happens with these rentier business models is that what you get is massive increase in price and in the price of services, and a massive collapse in the services provided. In the UK, one of the big focal points is the privatized water industry we have. There's no nice way to put this for the translators. Our rivers and our seas are swimming in shit. Literally swimming in shit. You will get a disease if you go to swim in the rivers, etc. And yet the amount of dividends, the payment to shareholders are huge. Just today in the newspapers, these private, quite a lot owned by these big asset management firms say, we need to put prices up a little bit more than we said before. Of course, right? So this is the problem. We know what happens when our infrastructure is owned by asset management firms. De-risking is going to do that in a massive, massive way, which is a huge, huge problem. So what are the, that's the bad news. So what are the strategic opportunities for that? When in abundance, when we talk about, we like to talk about public common partnerships. It's a little bit shorter than public communitarian, etc. But also because we want to think of it as, we want people to think about public common partnerships are trying to undo the things that public-private partnerships did, right? We want to think about, well, what did public-private partnerships do? You know, how did they sort of advance this sort of neoliberal project? How can we undo those, basically, to move society in a different way towards a more democratically planned communitarian sort of society? And so there are different ways in which you might approach that. There isn't what we might call, we talk about an inside-out and an outside-in strategy. They're not, we don't valorize them, but like the inside-out strategy might be, we need to perhaps, like in the municipal governments in Spain, perhaps we need to perhaps occupy the public and use that in order to promote the democratic economy, to promote the commons, etc. Right, that's a sort of outside-in strategy. And there are openings both in the Inflation Reduction Act, so in the US, and in the Labour Party's de-risking strategy in the UK. There are big openings in the US, you know, that it is possible to de-risk common ownership or public ownership through these tax credits. You can turn those tax credits actually into monetary sums that the state will give you, etc. In the UK, the Labour Party, in a contradictory way, is saying that we want to double the amount of cooperatives in the UK. We want to double the amount of energy cooperatives. And so there's an opportunity there to work from the outside in. But there's also, I think, a big opportunity to work from the, no, sorry, that's the inside out strategy, from the outside in, which is perhaps which can take various forms. One of the forms would be a more antagonistic battle, perhaps. A little bit perhaps like Can Batalla, where you know, with the Can Batalla, where there was the Tic Tac campaign. Do this or we occupy. It's like, oh, okay, it's a little bit of a threat. With Abundance, we worked, one of the projects we work with is a project in North London, a market in North London, Tottenham in North London, where there was a big, it's now a 20-year struggle where people were trying to defeat a gentrification campaign. And eventually in a gentrification campaign, you need to come up with an alternative plan for what to do with that site. And so they came up with their own community plan, and then we worked with them to see whether that could be a public common partnership, and then perhaps some of the surplus that gets produced from that market will then go to a community deliberation. But what else do we want in this area? We want a nursery. And there you start to produce an alternative plan, not just for the site, but perhaps for the whole area, which I think is also a little bit similar to what's going on in this neighbourhood here. So that's one sort of way, perhaps. And in the UK, one of the ways in which the government is de-risking is not necessarily, it is partly by taking the risks away from private investment, but they're also doing what's known as deregulatory de-risking, which is they're changing the regulations so that the big developers and the asset management firms get what they want, basically. They're going to rip up red tape, planning, laws. So we are predicting there's going to be a big wave of struggles to try to defeat these infrastructure projects and these new towns that they're building. So there's an opportunity for us to say, well, yeah, okay, you know, perhaps instead of de-risking private ownership, where we know what the outcomes are going to be, we'll de-risk these common ownership problems. And well, you know, there'll be, we hope, and we will try our best to see if these big anti-gentrification, anti-infrastructure campaigns develop, and then work with people to do alternative plans for that, in which that infrastructure, those services, or even perhaps even the house building is brought within community control. And the last thing I'll talk about is, like, one of the other conclusions we might gain from this idea that capital has been stagnating. So economic growth has been stagnating. It's not growing as much. And in fact, what we see is these sort of rentier business models where you try to extract rents, etc., are coming to dominate, you know, various parts of the things we need to live our lives, etc. In one way you could see that is capital is almost vacating certain areas. It will only address the train system in the UK through these ridiculously bad service and ridiculously expensive prices of tickets, etc. All sorts of sectors you look at, capital is not addressing the needs that we have. One of the other projects we work on in Abundance is a project in France to try to think about or try to develop public common partnership models for pharmaceutical production. We got invited into that because a network of pharmaceutical engineers, workers in pharmaceutical factories and researchers, they know, because this is their life, that there's a huge shortage of just normal everyday medicines in France and in many countries. Let's just paracetamol, for instance. There's not enough paracetamol being produced because their profits aren't there for the big pharma companies. They don't care. And these are researchers as well. These are pharmaceutical researchers, and they look at what gets researched and the misallocation of resources there. They say, no, we need a different system in order to not just do pharmaceutical production, but the research as well, so that research is oriented to our needs and not the needs of profitability. And, our production is oriented to that as well. And so that's another opportunity, is that capital is evacuating certain areas. It's addressing less and less of our needs, or it's addressing them in more and more of a bullshit manner, just to to foretell a little bit what the language we'll be using in our Radical Abundance book coming shortly. So I think I'm almost done here, right? I tried to set out, I think this is the situation we're in, the sort of conjunctural situation. This is almost this is the capitalist response to this de-risking state. It's not going to work on their own terms, let alone on our terms, right? And so we're in a situation where we need to come up with we're the ones who are going to have to step in to address our needs, the needs of the climate, etc., etc. And I think the de-risking state opens up certain opportunities for that. Some are rhetorical. Why should you be de-risking BlackRock to do this? You should be de-risking, the stuff that we own, etc. Some of it is just they are vacating space and we can move into it, perhaps. I'll leave it there. Yeah. Ooh. Perfectly on time.
I have no idea what time it is, so I'm going to rely on, I have no time device on me anywhere, so I'm going to rely on you to keep me on track. First to say thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and for being on this panel. Thank you to the translators. You guys have a really difficult job, so thank you so much for making it possible that a gringa like me can come and be here. So, gracias. I am not technically an economist, but we are all, or should all be, economists, right? My colleague Neil McEnroy will say that the word economy comes from the Greek oikonomos, which means of the home, right? And we are all keepers of the home. And so what we're talking about is returning the economy to its home, to us, to the community, to the land. So I love listening to Keir talk, and my job, at least ostensibly, if I'm good at it, is to try and translate some of these things with the work that people are doing on the ground into action, into comprehensible ideas and examples and inspiration for all of us. Mauro was saying that we have models. I'd say we all have models. There's tons of things going on in all of our communities, in the spaces that have been evacuated to meet our needs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the model that we've articulated called community wealth building that helps knit together some of that action. But I'll step back for a minute. So Keir was just talking about this massive concentration of wealth. And just to make that extremely concrete, we all know it. What does that look like? It means right now 5 men, and they are men, own 46% of the world's wealth. That wealth, the wealth of those 5 men has doubled since 2020. So in 4 years, the wealth of those 5 men has doubled, while 60 percent of the rest of the population have actually gotten substantively poorer. The rest of us have all gotten poorer while their wealth has doubled. This is unprecedented. It has never, ever happened in documented history. And it's not sustainable. And we are feeling the effects of that day in and day out. And we can't address our polycrises if we do not address that. And we are on the edge of collapse. And the systems that we have been in are collapsing. And the symptoms that we are feeling are a result of that. And so we're kind of racing against the clock. And I know that sounds bleak, but the good news, and you know this, right? I don't need to be telling you all this, but the good news is there are solutions, and we actually know the answers. We just need to actually move from the fringes of really great activity to the mainstream and the majority of our economy. So how do we do that? And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, places that are trying to do that in real time. And excuse me, I had prepared slides. I'm happy to share them afterwards. So if I'm a little scattered, it's because my slides keep me focused. And without them, I'm a little extemporaneous. So what we're talking about is the economy is designed, right? It is a structure that we have created, and we can recreate it, right? And so how do we recreate it in the way that we would like to see the people in this room and many other people beyond that? And I'm going to talk about community wealth building. Why wealth? So wealth is the defining feature of our economies. We've been talking about asset ownership, which creates wealth, and how that's getting concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. That ownership is incredibly important. And we can't redefine wealth. We can't create a new way of thriving and being healthy together unless we take control of those wealth-generating assets and begin to actually root that wealth in our own communities for ourselves and for the planet. So the idea, and we heard about it earlier in the opening remarks, Polyani and distribution, we need to talk about, redistribution, we need to talk about pre-distribution. How are we creating structures that don't allow wealth to agglomerate and then we have to redistribute in such a way to make it more equal, but rather actually have a more equitable distribution of that wealth to begin with. And the way that we can do that is through is creating mechanisms for direct economic ownership of wealth-generating assets in place. So having communities owning collectively the wealth-generating assets of their place. And so that's what community wealth building is. It is an economic development model that is based on increasing community ownership of wealth-generating assets in place. We look at that, and how do we do that? So we look across all aspects of a local economy. Traditionally, we think of that as land, labor, and capital, right? From an economic perspective, that's what we think of in terms of wealth-generating assets. We diversified that a little bit more to make it more specific to the places that we live in. In addition to labor, in addition to land, at capital, we're talking about finance, so both spending, we talked about public procurement as being a key lever of finance, and then capital control through banks and financial institutions. So, and then on top of that, enterprise ownership, and how can we diversify and democratize enterprise ownership as a wealth-generating asset. So those 5 pillars of a local economy are land and property, labor and work, public procurement, local finance flows, and economic enterprise ownership. So how can we look in all of those areas of a local economy and democratize the activities that are happening within all of those things? The good news is there are tons of activities happening in all of those pillars, right? Cooperative enterprise, community land trusts, public-private partnerships are a mechanism for that. Public commons partnerships. I can't keep track of all the terms. I'm sorry. Progressive procurement and social value procurement. is a way of doing that. There are many different activities across the spectrum, and they're happening everywhere. There's tons of this activity in Barcelona. Barcelona is a breeding ground for this kind of activity. But what community wealth building offers is a way to connect all of the activity across all of those pillars. So how are cooperatives connecting to the procurement, right? How is that procurement helping those local cooperatives to scale? How is finance and financial tools and financial mechanisms being created to support those kinds of developments? How is land being democratized and put into different valuation and usage and ownership so that it can support those kinds of cooperative economics? And what are the finances around that? And how is labor connected into all of that? So what are the interconnections in and among all of those activities? What's the policy? What's the capacity building? What's the infrastructure development? What's the ecosystem surrounding all of that? And that's what community wealth building offers, is a framework of connecting up all of that activity in a meaningful way. The idea being that as you start to connect those things, you begin to disrupt and displace extractive economic activity, right? You begin to fill those voids and demonstrate an alternative that begins to actually meet people's needs in place in a meaningful way and can begin to displace the extractive economic actors that we no longer need. That being said, so it's sort of a ground up model, but we need both the outside in and the inside out, right? And I'll speak a little bit about this in real terms with some examples of where this is happening. And just to say, this model of community wealth building grows from a strong tradition of cooperative economics, solidaritist economics, economic liberation movements from the civil rights movement to Ujamaa in Africa and other places. But what it lends to that is it lends that policy and institutional framework that helps to lift some of that beyond the local to a more scaled approach to local economic activity. So the term was first coined about 20 years ago in Cleveland, Ohio. That's when the term was first used. It began as sort of a modeling of the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque country here in Spain. But what would that look like if applied in a US context in a post-industrial city in the US? And it evolved from there, specifically working with the purchasing powers of the large anchor institutions in place in Cleveland, Ohio. So I'll speak a little bit about Cleveland. It's a post-industrial city. It had been a boom city at the turn of the last century, and it had an infrastructure for about 1 million people. But from about the post-war era, so about 1960 onwards, it suffered increasing in deindustrialization, and as a result of that, population flight, infrastructure decay, and all the associated decline that comes with all of that. So a city of about 1 million now is just over 500,000. So if you think about what that means and what that looks like in terms of infrastructure, in terms of services, in terms of tax base, it's devastating. And what happened, especially compounded in the US context of race and segregation, is that what happened is the communities that were left behind were largely African American communities that were divested and underserviced and isolated within the core of the inner city. So that all being said, in the center of Cleveland itself, there are large institutions, large hospitals, large universities, large cultural institutions, and of course the city of Cleveland itself. And in about 2008 or so, they came together and they looked around and they said, why is it that we are institutions that continue to exist and to a certain extent prosper, and yet we're surrounded by all this blight, all this decay, all this decline? And what would it look like if we much more intentionally connected ourselves to these communities that are suffering under this context? And so a very deliberate collaboration between community groups and those anchor institutions, what we're calling anchor institutions, place-based institutions that will not get up and move. They are non-for-profit or public institutions that are vested in the place, that their success is rooted to the place as well. They came together with community actors and they said, what can we do about this? And one of the first things they did was they analyzed their economic impact. So what were these institutions spending money on? Where was that money going? Who benefited from the money that these institutions were spending? These were institutions with budgets of upwards of $2 billion a year, right? Where is that money going? Well, most of it was not going to Cleveland. Most of it was going to large multinational organizations that service the contracts to those institutions with some supply chain locality, but very little actually staying rooted in the community. Very few of those actually benefiting the residents that lived within Cleveland itself. So from that analysis, they understood what kinds of things they were purchasing and where, and what kinds of things they could begin to purchase locally, and what would it look like to do that? What kind of capacity would be needed to do that? Long story short, they developed a network of employee-owned cooperatives that began to fill the gaps of not only the services that the institutions needed that they could start to get locally, but also to begin to create an economy for those communities that weren't there. So they created initially 3 employee-owned cooperatives at an industrial scale. Those were laundry, green retrofitting, and a greenhouse, a hydroponic greenhouse to provide lettuce and goods to the institutions, lettuce and herbs to the institutions. So those were the 3 initially. It took 10 years for those employee-owned cooperatives to stand up. They are now all profitable. We've lost one of the cooperatives, but then they've gained a few more. So now there's a network of 5 employee-owned cooperatives employing over 450 people in specific neighborhoods in Cleveland. This is what's called the Cleveland model. It is an inspiring model. It's also a limited model. It's a small neighborhood benefiting a few people in the city of Cleveland. It hasn't changed Cleveland's economic development strategy. The city of Cleveland has still put out to bid to try and attract Amazon's headquarters to come to Cleveland, right? To create poor jobs and outsource things. So it's the beginning of change. It's an example that shows a positive way, but it's very small and it's limited and it's hitting up against the walls of policy barriers, right? Resource access, and frankly, inertia and lack of imagination at multiple levels. So then we move across the pond where Preston in the United Kingdom, up in the north near Manchester, also a post-industrial city, learned about this example and thought, hey, maybe we could try this here. But they didn't have the infrastructure of community organizations. They didn't have the grassroots base that there was in the way that there was in Cleveland. And so they actually started where they could, which was with the city, with the local authority itself. How could the local authority redirect its procurement to more enterprises locally? And through that, how can they generate more local activity and invest in the kind of economic activity they would like to see. And so they've been able to scale now a cooperative network. It's very small, it's very burgeoning, but they have also created more social housing, a community land trust. They're beginning to start their own cooperative bank in the area. And so it's the beginning of all these nodes of across the 5 pillars that show, and it's beginning to produce positive outcome in places. It's actually showing an 11% increase in positive mental health outcomes in Preston, which is significant. And they've been able to do that over multiple years and track that development. So it's a growing movement with limitations, right? And of course, there's tons of this activity happening already, not necessarily thinking of itself as community wealth building, not necessarily coming together with institutional actors, with purchasing power, but also with financial tools and with policy supports. And So what you're starting to see is growing collaborations across places to do more of that. So in Scotland, for example, they've taken the inspiration from Preston, and that moved over to North Ayrshire in the west of Scotland. That now is actually using public land to create photovoltaic farms that are going to be publicly owned and producing profit that go back into the grid and are being used not only to fund new cooperative development funds, but also create more cooperatives as well. So I feel like I'm rambling, and this lamp is also very hot. So I will wrap it up here. But just to say that you're starting to see a lot more of this activity in places like Chicago, in places like Seattle. They're speaking with their public utilities about how can they not just go green, but democratize their ownership of utilities in Seattle. You're seeing it in St. Louis, where they've created a whole engaged strategy around co-creating a community wealth building strategy that is owned not by the city, but by local intermediaries, local community-based groups that work both at the grassroots and at the institutional level. So we're seeing a lot more of this. We're very good at seeing the differences rather than coming together. We need a lot more of that interconnected infrastructure. And I think that's where the movement is going, is providing those ecosystems of support around all of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Kier, for being so good with the timings. Yeah, I prepare a really long talk. I'm not gonna do a really long talk. First of all, because Berta and Ivan already settled the ground very good, so it helps a lot to take away some things. Also, to leave some time later to the questions. The idea is that now I'm gonna. It's a kind of difficult exercise to talk, looking to an international audience, because that's the way we thought about. Estic parlant en anglès, vale.
Sorry, I'm speaking in English all of a sudden, and I wasn't supposed to. Sorry. I was addressing myself to a big international audience. A lot of our colleagues we really want to share with. At the same time, there are many other people who are from Barcelona and who have already heard about what we do. So what I'm going to do is to try briefly draw radiography or a model. I'm from the 90s, as a boomer, Barcelona brand. The idea of using this way of urban transformation that the city underwent and that was exported as a brand, it was successful but criticized by social movements. So we need this alternative. This is the obsession about having an alternative model for the city. And there is also the return of Barcelona to internationalize through municipalization procedures, traveling politics and how politics can travel, etc. This is why we're mentioning models, and maybe this is not the most interesting thing to talk about. I think both presentations are bringing light in different complementary ways. on models on how to build these public community collaborations, making this possibility of replying and replicating these models, the public makers collaborating in these public community cooperation practices and partnerships. So I'd like to draw this picture of the Barcelona model, what we've been doing here. I'll try to do it quickly because we've heard about some of the things already, and I would like to talk about three dilemmas or three predicaments that we find ourselves in this public community partnership collaborations or cooperation movements that we have. I would like to recover this public community cooperation. We need a different name for this, right? But this idea was born in 2014 when the solidarity economy, the Catalan Solidarity Economy Network started speaking about the 14 local new measures about public policies, the local administration, which would be granting the universality of redistribution. The cooperativism counterpart would be granting the participation by workers in terms of benefits and decision making, and the community counterpart will be promoting the citizenship participation, the participation by the users, and the routing on the territory and the popular control. Based on this theoric three-leg base or ground, a lot of different experiences have been developed in the last years reflecting this three-legged model or three-leg ground. On one hand, we have community management with equipments and public services in the city of Barcelona. Only in terms of civic management, we have over 30 models, sports fields, cultural centers, sport concert halls, adult centers, sustainable mobility hubs, different kinds of enterprise hubs, and daycare, primary care centers, many other examples, up to 70 experiences, where it is the community through different forms of organizations, often linked to social and solidarity economy, directly managing, making the decisions about the needs, identifying and establishing the rules, giving themselves their own rules in order to govern and manage that public service. We are speaking about public services here, and this is quite peculiar. When speaking about this to someone who comes from abroad, it is interesting. This was regarding management, but if we talk about cooperatives and cooperativism, the cooperativism movement in the last years, as Ivan said before, the cooperatives of a session of use and of housing with a session of use. We have over 30 experiences in growth in the social and solidarity economy. We have specifically the promotion, including this model of collaborative housing or cooperative housing, or this model which consists of transfer of use in housing. How to promote this cooperative housing based on the transfer of use. We adapted this model here with the scalability of the public sector. And this is an actual, real alternative form of accessible housing here at home in Catalonia. There are also ecological transition spaces, green points, consumption, energy consumption, communities and initiatives, and other workshops, experiences on equipment markets, spaces for different kinds of production, community kitchen, solidarity, diners, fab labs. And one of the things we've become involved in Hydra, industrial infrastructure such as the slaughterhouses. There is a whole universe. It was mentioned. We've mentioned how they were created. There's a legacy. We're celebrating the 125th anniversary of the cooperation initiatives. We have the Republican common experiences. The bourgeois movements have tried to hide this, but the common community movements in Catalonia have played a very important roles. Occupation and squatting has been an important movement in Catalonia. Community management owes a lot to this. The tradition of association in Catalonia since the 19th century, we have all this history. And another thing that explains our history is the possibility that we have made good use of these new windows of opportunities and the inside-outside strategies that Kerr was speaking about. And obviously, there have always been an importance in creating popular power as the main path on which we need to base ourselves. But oftentimes, 15M, oftentimes like during the for the 15M, that created a certain window of opportunity for public cooperative collaboratives, and the sovereignty movement was allowing the opportunity to reorganize economy. Those were moments which cracked the state systems. They came from outside the state, and this is how we've been operating in terms of public community partnerships. And other systems such as care, food systems, public injections of money have come from Europe, promoting the creation of public community collaboration. And we have not been able to use this. The money has ended up in technology capitalism, in commoditized technology. We probably were not able to access these funds. So we are also to blame. Sometimes there were bids for €1 million, and in 5 days, we were given 5 days to demonstrate, what we as the third social sector were meaning to do. Some windows of opportunities were used and some others were not. But it all paints the backdrop where we find ourselves right now. The situation is that in Catalonia and Barcelona, the number of conferences, meetings, and other solidarity and social economy gatherings and events have grown since 2015 until today. Over 30% of the cooperatives we have in Catalonia have been created, and there's been growth in their articulation and ambition. Ivan Miro was speaking about this territorial dimension, creating networks, creating cooperative ecosystems, and capacity to generate the territory, to articulate an economic planning in an alternative and democratic way through this territorialization, of which Block 4 is an important part, and different circles. And the foundational economy about which you speak is something we should base ourselves on, generating cooperatives, popular economies in those fields where they are needed. This is why we have a structure of Block 4 and Coopolis around the circles, the strategic circles of transition elements. There's a growth in the acknowledgement by the public administration to social economy, and it is a strong one. there is a process where even if a new government came into power, the new director or the new minister, it was difficult to hear a minister talk about policies in favor of social and solidarity economy, and this has changed. We heard this today. There's been a new commissioner for social economy in Can Batlló. We have one of the examples of these public policies that have favored social solidarity economy. The Catalan government has regionally created cooperative associations such as the one we are here. It is a space coming out of a public community cooperation. Cooperatives have been created. Democratic planning of economy has been created. Territory and sectoral circles. The Comunitats program has been launched, a new paradigm of action, of community action, of social action. Economic value is to be created from the pre-existing networks. The public sector is putting resources into place, and the networks themselves are deciding on how they will reinvest them, basing these investments on mutual support. And this is a change in the paradigm that we had been using. It generates questions and doubts that we will have to tackle. This professionalization of social movements, the inclusion of the third sector in the ecosystems. There are certain elements that need to be studied. There is a clear bet from the regional government for social and solidarity economy. The City Council of Barcelona is creating spaces of consultation. The 3030 Barcelona social economy strategy to generate fluid discussion, and new laws have been written and approved. And that would be the last point of the backdrop or context I'd like to draw, that I was drawing. In terms of public community cooperation. As it has been said, the new Catalan social economy law will be approved shortly, and it speaks about interesting things such as how to promote social economy further by means of creating public community cooperative cooperation. It's one of the things that the law is mentioning to promote plural economy. One of the ways to promote plural economy is to take public sectors and create public community cooperative collaborations as a way of reinforcing it. When I was writing this, I got tired myself. But it was just an exercise of just realizing how far we've gone. So the context is clearly like a war context almost. It's a context of war, war conjunction, it's austerity, and there will be difficulties. It will be difficult to turn this around. So the context is less favorable than 15 years ago, but the last 15 years have taken us where we are. What would be our next 3 challenges? And that would be my last point. As a movement, I'll say 3. It could be 2 or 5, but I'll just say 3, okay? It sounds better. First, rules, normatives. We've been obsessed in the Coopolis Observatory about regulations. We've become so obsessed with regulations. Is it really an interesting element in order to take steps forwards in terms of public community cooperative cooperations? Tomorrow, it will be one of the issues that we will be dealing with in the workshops. But taking the example of the Cleveland case, community work building, it's not so much about thinking about regulations, but rather about thinking about they will be implemented or applied, how we will work together along with these regulations that we are doing and taking one step further. In the case of Barcelona, we have two experiences in reformist municipalism, which are more interesting for me, at least personally, which are so frustrating: the public procurement and the citizen heritage program. They are both very interesting projects, but in reality, they are taking us to a situation where it is not really happening. Their potential is not being used. The European legal framework gives you every possibility in terms of public procurement. The legal framework is very interesting. It is wide, and it gives us the possibility of making a reservation of public procurement with contracts based on territorial and social solidarity criteria. We can do this on the basis and in the framework of the European legislation. 30% of the GDP
Importantíssima de la nostra cultura.
in Catalonia is public procurement. It's based on public procurement. In Barcelona only, less percent of the public procurement is being done on plural economy. So we have a problem. We have a problem also in the case of citizenship heritage. We are not being able to replicate the Can Batlló model in other sectors. This is a problem. How do we implement those regulations? How do we apply them? I think this is down to three causes. There is a legal safety issue. It's not very clear where the regulation is to be applied. There are discrepancies depending on the European regulation, etc. And this will give the lawyers excuse or politicians excuse not to end up applying. It happens with citizen heritage. It happens with public procurement. If our colleagues from the Raval, or the ladies from the neighborhood, from the poor neighborhood, should be hired for the lighting, they end up not being hired, and then the typical company will end up being hired. Company depending on a big Florentino Perez, to give you an example, owned company. Or we cannot keep on saying that we need farmers and local consumption, and then keep on speaking about the new food plan for local consumption, and then the main element that could be working in favor of this is our anchor institutions, our schools, hospitals. They should buy from local food, from our farmers. Wouldn't it be easy? It'd be so easy, and that would, at least in Catalonia, would have a good strategy. We have the grounds for this public procurement, so why not? Why is it not being done? It must be put in the agenda, and then creating the support structures necessary, technical formats by the city councils, carrying out campaigns within what we're calling professionalization structures of public employees and staff. Why obsession with anchor institution models? If you have a model such as the Cleveland model, and Cleveland University is the only one that didn't leave them, and all the capital is left in the deindustrialization process, but they are staying there, so they will be buying the toilet paper, buying from the local producers. Then we will, if there is no toilet paper manufacturers, we will create a cooperative that will produce toilet paper. So public procurement can be translated thus into specific models. So it's more a matter of how we apply and implement this law. And then next, how to broaden the scope of effect. IDRA speaks about all-in right, strategic plurality. We need to attack from different angles and through different strategies, and at the same time. We clearly have a community model for public management and a good law that is allowing us to carry out public service, public community cooperative models. Let's look at health centers, care services, food services in municipal centers, physical, natural material, heritage management, community tourism, forestry management. All of these are fields that can be managed from public community cooperative cooperation. It can be done. It is a very clear line of work. And then there is another debate within the left wing movements. This is privatizing, this is externalizing. We're being interviewed by El Salto because in the Basque Country they are being so scandalized because for some people, for certain people, this public community cooperative movement is an outsourcing activity and a privatization. It is not. This has nothing to do with corruption. Creating a public service which has the participation of the community will make that community feel that service their own. So that process will be very difficult to turn around once the process of communalization has been done. So I don't agree with their views. I don't see this as a potential outsourcing, but I would say to them, where you see public sector with a long process of fight, a long trade union fight and history, and a process of privatization, yes, we need to remunicipalize. Let us not create community management. Let us remunicipalize the model of cooperatives, mixed cooperatives, such as the ones that we are seeing in Valencia or Andalusia. We don't have this in the law in Catalonia, but let us, yes, remunicipalize services where there is a trade unit fight, where workers' conditions can be improved. We will not remunicipalize the slaughterhouses. The slaughterhouses is a case. Some of them have become libraries. Some others have become municipal slaughterhouses. It is something which is fundamental for our farmers. And it has been abandoned. You need to go to private slaughterhouses nowadays. How to recover public slaughterhouses? Not remunicipalizing, but introducing the solidarity and social economy energy, like in the case in Mantera, generating a democratic model, a connection, and with a short food tissue. This is an interesting model to replicate in other places. This is where we have a field that we can walk or go. Another thing, our French colleagues would have liked to come, but they weren't able to come this time, would be to carry out new procedures for the recovery of the staff that have been left without work when companies go bankrupt, like Duralex.
I remember we had Duralex plates at home when I was a kid. They weren't precisely nice, but anyway, we could have a public service that helps companies that go bankrupt to become a cooperative and be put in the hands of the workers. I think that's another element. And I think I've run out of time. So yes, I'll leave it at that. Okay. Well, I have the third challenge, the one on metrics, which I can try summarizing in 2 minutes, and this has to do, and this is one of the things we've been working at a lot on at the observatory, and we are planning to continue working on this in the next years. We are looking at European projects to see how we can put our GDP indicators into the bin and change our metrics, because from the social and solidarity we know very well one way is to avoid imposters from the commodified sectors. What is fashionable is the ESG, and they're saying no, we don't need non-profit as an important element. You can have a profit, not a savage form of profit, but one that has social values. So this is what is allowing the owners of Carrefour to say it's green and friendly and eco-friendly while it supports genocide and it destroys our food producers. They're creating all of these labels. It's important not just in terms of public debate, but also for public policies and regulations when it comes to there's a Spanish law on cooperative economy, and we had to fight a lot to keep for-profit companies out of the advocacy work. I mean, it's an ongoing discussion. How do we define ourselves? How do we name ourselves? And how do we measure ourselves? That would be the next point. What makes our economy different? We know this, we're putting it into practice, but an important thing is how do we explain our theory of change? How can we make people see that we are different? How do we explain ourselves better? Once again, in Catalonia, and we've lost the opportunity, but in Portugal you have the satellites of social economy, and by looking at the statistics in the sector, you can look at the historical timeline. You see when in 2008 where the economy was dropping, the plural economies during the financial crisis were the only ones growing. They were much more resilient. They were grounded in the territory. So if we have satellite social economy case here, like in this would provide us with indicators to prove how our economic model is beneficial. It's something we'll have to continue working on intensely at Coopolis. And with that, I will wrap up my speech. And in doing so, I hope I am sticking to time. Thank you. Okay. So we could maybe have 5 or 10 minutes for Q&As. 15 minutes? Okay, 15 minutes for questions from the floor. Any questions, any comments, suggestions? Now is the time. Hi, good afternoon, and thank you so much for your presentations. I mean, whenever I come here to Barcelona, I leave with a feeling of frustration, feeling frustrated. I have a dilemma between how to generate this democratic ideal of these public community partnerships with all of the elements of cooperatives, participation and redistribution when looking at the current emergencies, and the times are different, the time frames are different. So if we all agree that we're living in a time of emergency where at the same time we do not, in many contexts, we are not able to generate community wealth because there is no community, that generates a class bias. And I mean, who are these processes benefiting and who is left out? So in all of this, I am missing a stronger political hypothesis, a political project that could include many more people. So my question is, how can we build a political hypothesis where we link these community development processes, building a community, with a strong state policy, the pre and redistribution that Sarah mentioned before? Thank you for that question. Shall we take more questions? Shall we answer one at a time? What do you think? Should we take another question, maybe? Another comment before answering? No one? Yes? I have a question on the issue of public procurement that Sarah was mentioning, and the need. I mean, we're looking at the design. You mentioned the architecture of public procurement. I think it's a key element. Mauro, I think, also touched on this. I wanted to hear if you could tell us more about what elements, in terms of territorial indicators, I mean, things in Spain, there's a lot of negative case law. In a public bidding specification, you cannot include an indicator that favors companies that are local to Barcelona. You can do other things in the bidding specification. It is true that the European framework and the state framework allow for much more than is actually done by local administrations. And I agree that the being linked to the territory is key. But what happens in Spain is that you have to find legal shortcuts and find social indicators saying, okay, so this company must have its headquarters close to where it delivers its service, but you cannot say the company should have its headquarters in Barcelona. When it comes to companies that employ people traditionally excluded, then there's an exemption. But I mean, there is no indicators that are allowed that can force you to use social enterprises, for instance. And we should have a quota, perhaps, in the
Great
total
questions.
public
I'll start with
procurement
the
or the
last,
city
and
councils,
I'll
or
also
even at
like
the
to
national
address the
level. So
first.
you were saying before.
One, ultimately, we're going to have to change law. I mean, that ultimately has to happen. But in the meantime, as you were saying, there are many things that can be done. So first of all, I think there's a great ignorance about what can be done. And so people continue to just operate in the way that they've always operated. So first of all, education, especially getting at procurement officers. I mean, a lot of procurement officers are trained to think in a very, very narrow way. So, for example, in the places we've worked that have been able to shift procurement strategies, like in Preston, there was a lot of education of those procurement officers in institutions. And that does require sort of an institutional commitment to think of these things differently. So, I mean, that's not always readily available to everyone, but if you do have a willing institution that wants to start to do things differently, you can do that kind of, for lack of a better term, re-education, if you will, around that. So that's one part of it. There are lots of things that you can do with the contracts themselves, even if you can't actually specify local. But if you actually break the size of the contract down into smaller amounts, that makes it so much easier for local or smaller enterprises to actually bid for those contracts. So that's something that's fairly simple to be done. Similarly, changing your payment structure. So often procurement is done where they pay you once a quarter, which is not something that small businesses can sustain, right? So if they change that to once a month cycles or something of that nature, that can make a huge difference. So you can begin to change the behavior that, even though you might not necessarily weigh or track by a certain indicator or demographic, will actually help improve and open up that process. In the UK, they have something called a Social Value Act, which actually requires that they put valuation towards positive social outcomes, however those are defined. So, and that was done, the Social Value Act was done before they left the EU, so it is something that can be layered on top of existing law. So there are workarounds, but I do actually think one of the biggest problems is the sort of inertia and narrowness of the field, if you will, around this. And I think that's changing, and a lot of that, I see that especially in the health sector, because you can talk about the social determinants of health and how those are localized and how those are based on environment. And that can be an argument that speaks also to, for lack of a better word, the bottom line of the health institution, right? They can spend a lot more money dealing with the negative consequences of poor health due to, joblessness and homelessness and all these things, or they can use their economic activity to change that dynamic and that outcome. So addressing things upstream rather than downstream. So making those kinds of arguments in willing spaces, I think, is a start. Easier said than done, I know. And then just to the previous point, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think that is, we ultimately can't succeed. And I did mention, these are good models, but they're limited models. And we ultimately cannot succeed until there's a political movement around it as well. There has to be a politics to this work as well. The question is, where do you begin, right? And we need millions of hands at the till, right? These models are meant to inspire and to give people a sense of what's possible. They're not the be-all, end-all. That's not the goal, right? We don't want to just have local procurement to cooperatives. We want to have want to have thriving communities, right? We want to have people who are connected to one another and to their place. So it's about how do you build the models to inspire, but not have that be the end goal, right? That's just a piece of a puzzle. We did find, for example, though, in Preston, and one of the critiques of Preston, which is legitimate, is that it was in many ways a top-down model, right? It was driven by government, right? Government said, we want to change things, we're going to use our procurement, and we're going to do things in a certain way. But now they're sort of backing into, well, wait a minute, where is community in this? And what you started to see was sort of a reverse engineering into community. I wouldn't recommend that per se. It was where to start, but it's getting there, and now it's starting to return political results. And that's, I say political there in traditional politics, but you are seeing that the labor-led government there has been able to continue to control the local authority and win elections. And I mean, that's not the whole purpose of it, but it's beginning to be connected to a politics as well, right? The outcomes of that community wealth building effort is connected to outcomes in politics as well. That's just a very small example and not necessarily exactly what we want, but there has to be a layer of political education, engagement, and mobilization that goes with this to get to scale, to be perfectly honest. And we talk about, inside out, outside in. I mean, we need, the state, we need to reclaim the state. I mean, we've talked about being in and against the state, right? We need to be able to work within it, but then change it, right? We can't just allow it to continue as it is, democratizing the state as well. And so, I mean, these are small efforts to begin to do this, but it's just a question of where do we begin and how, and we need all of the above at the same time is the short answer. And, this question about being in crises and how can you, where do you intervene when you got to have people housed and fed in the midst of crises, and you can, I mean, that's a hard argument to make because you have a very reactive environment there. But if you don't make the change, we're just going to be compounding the crises over and over and over again. They're just going to get worse. So we need to begin to build that resilience argument into the politics of this as well.
I'll try to address your questions a little bit. Perhaps I'll try to skip your questions, but I might come back to it at the moment, in a moment, because there were a couple of points I think you made. One of them was about like this time frame problem, the time frame of like incredibly pressing time frame of climate change, and that is something that structures our thinking in abundance quite a lot. One of the images that we try to use to think this through is to say that there's a gap between what's possible and what's necessary, basically. And so when we have to start from what's from now, basically, but you know, the society we live in has a very constrained sense of what's possible to do, right? So we can map out, we can sort of forecast, well, if we did this, perhaps we could get here, sort of thing. So we can sort of map out what's possible. In fact, part of what I was doing with the de-risking state was that this is the conjuncture. These might be the possibilities that emerge over the next 5 to 10 years, etc. So we can do that. And people have mapped the necessary as well, where it is necessary to get to. Lots of people have done that, but people talk about a safe and just operating space for humanity. So that scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Center, they say there's 9 Earth system processes which human civilization depends on. We can make the best estimates of the tipping points, the points at which they stop being stable and step into something else, which we basically don't know if we can cope with. And then we can add some sort of like, that's the outer rim of like, you know, these are the natural things that we can't go beyond. And then you can add, you know, just the basic social needs that you would want people to be able to access, and that's the sort of just bit perhaps. So look, you can have any form of social and economic and technical organization you want as long as you fits within this safe and just operating space for humanity. That's one way of mapping the necessary. And then you can use that to sort of backcast, basically, rather than forecast. Oh, we need to get here. What are the steps we need to put into place there? We forecast and we backcast. There's a big problem. There's a gap, right? There's a gap between what seems possible now and where we need to get to. That is the gap that produces climate denialism. That's the gap that produces climate anxiety and depression and all of these sorts of things. So lots of techno fixes try to change the necessary, right? So there's a certain, you know, it's very hard to change the net. There's so much carbon we can put into the atmosphere before we have these temperature rises. Perhaps we can put sulfur into the atmosphere and all of these sorts of crazy things. Really, the problem is not that. The problem is, how do we expand what is socially and politically possible? That's the problem that we're faced with. And basically, there are various ways you can do that, but really the only way to do that is to increase what we call popular protagonism. Basically increase the amount of people who have an understanding of where they fit into the world and then are organized to act on that world in some sort of way. That's the thing that pushes forward social possibility, basically. And you know, in fact, perhaps the whole sort of the wager of this whole conference is that perhaps you need it, you know, organized communities, as you said. Communities don't exist. But like, do they ever? They have to be produced, they have to be created. And perhaps the wager is that like institutions are where we're trying to address the needs of social reproduction, perhaps contest reproduction with capital by having a plural economy, which are in some sort of contest. Perhaps those institutions are the seeds upon which communities can be organized. And we just look at around us here, you know what I mean? And popular protagonism can be produced. That's my sort of idea of how this would fit together, if you know what I mean.
And can I just build off that too? Because I think the theory too about community wealth building is if you distribute wealth in a way that more people have more stability in that wealth and benefit from that wealth, right? Then they have more time and ability and stability to create that community and that you know, that identity, if you will. So it's, again, it's a chicken or the egg conversation here, right? We don't necessarily have the politics there yet, but that's because, I mean, and I'm an American, people don't have time for it, right? They don't have time for community. They're working their asses off, right? They're barely getting by. And so how do we create the stability to even begin to do that co-creation, that production of community and space that produces politics? And so it's almost like we're starting from negative, right? We have to give people that basis so that we can even have the space to do that. And so that's the gamble in what we're trying to do with community wealth building, is that it's not perfect. It isn't, you know, the way we would model it in you know, if we could start from scratch, but it's how we can begin to get wealth and stability back to people so that they can reclaim that space and that power. It's a starting point.
I've talked too much before, so I'm not going to talk. Just to answer your question, I think that...
Sorry again, I was speaking in English again. Sorry. To answer your question, I think tomorrow we have a panel where we'll be hearing of the Jackson, Mississippi, Quebec, and the Venezuela cases. I think these are strong hypotheses and strategies where community building has been done in a different dimension. I think maybe tomorrow would be the ideal moment to further discuss this, although I must say I totally agree with what you say. And unless
Iyan, saya namamati.